Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Chris Benner. I'm the director of the Institute for Social Transformation and a professor of environmental studies and sociology here at UC Santa Cruz. And I'll be moderating tonight's discussion and indeed this whole series, the University Forum Election Series. The UC Santa Cruz University Forum is an ongoing series focusing on the relevance of the research at UC Santa Cruz to community and the broader social, economic, environmental, and political issues of the day. And we proudly feature the impact of research conducted by UC Santa Cruz faculty. And this election series, this is the first of a four-part series, is co-sponsored by the Institute for Social Transformation here at UC Santa Cruz, whose mission is to support innovative scholarship that changes the world. Before we jump in tonight, a few housekeeping things. I want to share a few details. First, we're using this webinar tool, so there's no chat function for those of you who are used to that on Zoom. We will have an opportunity, and in fact encourage you to ask questions, and we'll answer that at the end of the program. So we invite you to submit your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom panel there. Just click on that, and you can submit your questions at any time. And finally, tonight's event will be recorded and posted online if you want to share it with your friends and colleagues going forward. So just to introduce a bit of the theme for tonight in this series, we've called this election series Elections, What Are They Good For? In a little bit of a provocative way, and not to imply that elections are good for nothing, because in fact, they of course are good and frame important choices that can make a difference. And this election in particular creates a stark contrast between the presidential candidates as well as a whole series of issues on the California ballot around different propositions. But what we want to do in this election series is not so much talk about the specific choices we have, but the broader context of the election, so we can better understand what frames the choices we're given and the choices we're not given, and what are the other ways we need to be thinking about and practicing democracy in our society. So thinking about the broader demographic changes, the broader social movements on both the right and the left, how those relate to elections, thinking about our very political institutions themselves and what opportunities do they create and constrain for democratic participation. And then linking all that to this very moment where we have a series of really unprecedented events and processes shaping the decisions in this moment. A president whose practice of politics, whatever you might think of them, is quite different than we're used to in our normal politics, let's say. A pandemic, movements for racial justice that have reached a point of visibility and strength we haven't seen in at least a generation. Of course, issues of climate change, and all of that is creating some new political possibilities as well as fears about the impacts of that. And so that introduces tonight this first session in our election series, which is going to set the context for the other sessions coming in the next few weeks. And we've titled this session tonight, Hope, Fear, and Desire for Democracy, because we really want to highlight all of our emotions and how we think about and approach the political process in our country, and thinking about in this moment, what are the political possibilities we might hope for might come out of this moment, as well as the emotions bound up in that around fear and despair and senses of widespread abandonment from government from many people. And then really thinking about how do we enact change from bottom up, top down, and different processes. And so our goal tonight is not to have a lot of presentations. It's really to have an informal conversation with all of you in your living rooms, just a few of us here with each of you, over 200 now who have joined us tonight. But it's an informal conversation with some of the smartest people on the planet who are looking at these issues and researching them and thinking about them. And so I want to introduce our panelists, and then we'll jump right in. If I were to give them a proper introduction, we'd use up really the full 90 minutes just explaining all of their accomplishments. I want to be short. But I really encourage you to look at their research, look at their websites, and look at their full bios. So Dean Mathiowetz is a professor in the politics department at UC Santa Cruz. He has a PhD in political science from UC Berkeley, another University of California alum. And his research interests are in democratic theory, the history of political economy, the philosophy of language, and the politics of mindfulness. We're also joined tonight by Deborah Gould, who's a professor in the sociology department at UC Santa Cruz. We have a very interdisciplinary sociology department because Deborah Gould's PhD, and I will call you Debbie tonight if you don't mind, is a PhD in political science from the University of Chicago. And Debbie's research is on political emotion and affect, how that relates to social movements and contentious politics, classical and contemporary social theory, as well as feminist and queer theory and lesbian, gay, and queer studies. And then we're very pleased tonight to be joined from across the country. Christina Belchon is a professor in the Department of Social and Cultural Analysis, as well as Director of Graduate Studies at NYU, New York University. She's a banana slug. She graduated from UC Santa Cruz with a bachelor's in politics. Her PhD is also in political science from Rutgers University, and her research interests include democratic theory, Latino politics in the US, American political thought, race, and ethnicity. And I'm just gonna lift up right now, because we'll talk about it more. She has a book that's coming out literally in weeks called Cruelty as Citizenship: How Migrant Suffering Sustains White Democracy. And it's out next month with the University of Minnesota Press. So if we're all in person, we clap and welcome them all. But I want to start maybe with you, Christina, to really help us think about this moment and the political possibilities of this moment. And what have you seen in the last few months that's crystallized for you things about this moment and the opportunities and the newness of this time?
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this panel, Chris. And it's really a pleasure to be in this conversation and to have a chance to talk to some of my favorite people. So thanks first off for that. I'm glad you started with the word unprecedented, because I think this question of sort of as you were saying, like, what is the sort of moment of newness that I sort of noticed at the beginning of this. I'm in New York City, so I was here during the height of the first wave of the pandemic and the COVID-19 lockdown that happened here in the city. And I think the thing that really struck me at the very beginning, right, was the absence of people in the streets. Those of you who've been to New York or lived in New York, empty New York streets are not normal. And they were, it was really unnatural and sort of eerie, but also sort of beautiful. And, you know, when I'd go outside on my balcony, I'd hear birds in this way that, like, I'd never heard them before. They were just a cacophony. The city was quieter. And, you know, I'd go to a Trader Joe's in Soho, and I would go downtown, and, you know, my partner and I we'd go down there, and we would see Broome Street or Grand, and the streets that are always taking you to the Hall and Tunnel that are always packed. And it was like 4 p.m. and they were almost empty. And what the streets were full of were, not full, but what the streets had in them were bicycles and bicyclists and pedestrians walking in the street. And so, so I guess what I'm just pointing to is, on the one hand, it was empty, but it was also, it was like this glimmer of a potential kind of a future of New York. Like, New York could look a different way. And you could literally see that manifesting in this moment of crisis. And it was empty, but it was also this moment of collective action. Like, we were all staying at home in part because we were trying to save each other's lives. So the emptiness was also this kind of shared attempt at helping each other. And so it made you think about how the city could change, right? And I think I've just felt like that since March. Like, ever since this has begun, I have felt, for more than I ever have before, more than 9/11, that I'm living history, that I'm in this radical moment of history. Like, I think about how people must have felt during World War II, or like during the Blitz in London, where, you know, now we have a nostalgia about that, but those people didn't know how it was going to turn out, right? And so I think it's that sense that like anything can happen, and anything means something good, and anything could be something really bad. So I think that's just led me to sort of be veering between a lot of different feelings, between being, you know, anxious and full of despair, but also excited. And just, I think the undercurrent for me has always been that there's something new happening, and that something new could happen, and something new is happening. Yeah.
It's interesting to think about envisioning that new space of the city for bicycles, pedestrians, people, because we have such car-based cities. And yet then you can also contrast the emptiness of the streets in March with the fullness of the streets in the midst of the movement for Black Lives protests. And I wonder, Debbie or Dean, do one of you want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in this moment about the political possibilities of linking the pandemic and the movements for racial justice?
Yeah, I'll jump in. You know, I think that the pandemic, you know, kind of, well, going back actually to the election of Trump, I think that was very clarifying in certain ways, where the white supremacy that had been masked in our country, and as if we were in a post-racial moment, really bared itself and has been since then in very emboldened, bald-faced ways. And with the pandemic, I mean, I think it has revealed first of all, what 40 plus years of disinvestment in public services, public goods, what that reveals, and what in terms of the life and death consequences of that, differently for differently positioned people. But that along with, and then the utter, you know, the further abandonment under Trump and the way that Trump has handled the pandemic, I think, and the ways in which the pandemic has been disproportionately affecting the most vulnerable and disproportionately people of color, you know, Black, Indigenous people of color, really, and that has just become very stark, I think. And then with, and not to mention the economic consequences of all of that in terms of just massive unemployment and the threat of massive evictions. And, you know, we're living through an economic collapse in many ways. And then, you know, you add to that the climate catastrophes that are really manifesting on the West Coast in a tremendous way right now, and the ways in which the underfunding of firefighting resources, the ways in which fires are being fought by a big part of the firefighting force are incarcerated people who are paid $1 an hour, who are now in quarantine because they've been disproportionately affected by COVID. Mm-hmm. And then add to that the ongoingness of state violence against you know, Black and brown bodies, and poor and working class people. And we all have learned, I think, in this moment, amid this incredible uprising, we've learned quickly about the origins of policing and the role it plays in protecting property, including enslaved peoples. I mean, not protecting, to, you know, protect property, the property of the slaveholders. And the way policing is used against working people trying to organize for better conditions and so on. I think it's a moment that is urging us to become anti-capitalist, because I mean, I think it really just, all of these intersecting crises lend themselves to that sort of an analysis. So recently I read something about people out here, wealthy people, buying fire trucks, fire engines. And of course, this has been going on, hiring private firefighters to defend their homes. And I can understand why people, if you have the resources, why you would do that. But all of these crises indicate that individualized solutions don't work. And we are so interconnected with one another that the sorts of solutions that we need right now require fundamental social transformation, as the Institute social transformation.
Yes. To promote.
Right. And so I think that there's something about all of these intersecting crises really crystallizing and kind of urging us to become anti-capitalist. And that, of course, is very challenging. What does that mean? And how do we help people inhabit the uncertainty of this moment and the uncertainty of fundamental transformation that is necessary?
Dean, I wonder if you can help us think through a bit more the social movements and radical imaginations of the right and the left. I mean, Debbie's laying out this image of, a time to think about a post-capitalist society and defunding the police and imagining a society that doesn't need police to help people. And yet you also have those on the right who are imagining, anarchists in the street and invading the suburbs and, taking over our America from a white supremacist perspective. And so we've got this social imaginations on both sides contesting for political space in our national consciousness. How do we think about those conflicting forces?
I mean, it seems to me that this question around how do people think about what their alternatives are in the face of old orders beginning to shift and change. And so part of what Debbie has been talking about is, and Cristina have both highlighted the ways in which new forms of kind of imagination, about what self-governance might mean, and what collective participation and action might mean on the left. But there are also people react in very different ways to something that looks like fluidity, change, things being upended. And it can also stir in people, and I think we all feel certain dimensions of this, concerns about disorder being something like chaos. And therefore, there is also a kind of urge or a drive, and I think we see it, it's especially pronounced on the right, but for a certain kind of, well, they talk about it in terms of the law and order, right? So that this represents the other side of the way of wanting to react or respond to this openness and fluidity, is the idea that some kind of order creating force needs to come in. And sort of that could be the way to handle and deal with some of these, sort of handle the dystopian panorama, right, that is unfolding around us. And that for some of us seems like, while it's terrifying, I feel terrified by a lot of what I see. We're also in this conversation have started by saying, what are the possibilities for hope in this? But we also, in that way, need to be and want to be thinking about the ways in which a variety of different political responses to that it can give rise to a variety of different political responses.
It's funny when you say that, because I keep thinking, like, in 2016, I felt like what Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump shared was this general sense that, and what voters who supported either of them, I think in many ways were saying was, something is broken. This situation is broken. It's not working. It's failing. And they wanted to register their sense that something was broken. Now, what they thought was broken is radically different, and what the solution to that brokenness might be was really different, right? And one side, the solution was, anti-immigrant politics or law and order or whatever, and the other side was, maybe going beyond capitalism or thinking about reforming capitalism in radical ways, social democracy. But I'm struck by the fact that we already had this sense that things were deeply broken, and there was kind of a rebellious sense among a lot of voters that something had to change. And it's interesting, now I feel like one of the that sense is only deepened for many Americans, many more than even those initial supporters. But I think one of the real questions I have as somebody of the left, as a progressive, is thinking about we have to fill in what that new world looks like, because the right is so good at describing anything that's not what is dystopian disaster. You know, it's if we don't have radical housing segregation, then your suburbs are destroyed. If you don't have, you know, if you have the movement of people that's dignified and treats human beings with meaning and respect, then it's open borders and it's chaos. And so they have a story every time about the nightmare that's coming if we don't just revert back to what was, or do something radically horrible, like try to close off the border or try to you know, undo the welfare state. So I guess I think for me, that's my question for both Debbie and Dean. I keep thinking about is like, we have to sort of, I feel like a big task of the left now is we can't just say abolish police. We have to describe what this new form of law and justice would look like. And we have to paint a picture of an alternate world where if you're mentally ill or you're mugged, that there's another way of dealing with crime and with violence and with damage, right? Like, you know, and so just saying abolish the police obviously isn't enough. And I think that's I guess that's one of my worries, is that we gesture towards another future. I feel like conservatives have they painted a picture. I feel like we're still painting our picture of that other world. And I guess I'm thinking a lot about that question. How do we paint that picture so that people will want to join it and will say, oh, that looks much better than what I have, rather than saying, oh, let's just get back to normal.
Yeah, I mean,
let's go with Debbie for a little bit, then back to you, Dean.
I really agree that, you know, with what you're saying, Christina, about one of the key tasks of the left right now is to fill that out, you know, in more detail. And of course, abolitionists have been doing that. Like for 20 years, when they've been talking about what they mean by that, they talk about coming up with alternatives and alternatives to policing and so on. And I mean, I think and I agree also with what you were saying, I think we're in such a transitional moment where what I think for a long period of time, you know, 40 plus years, people had been kind of buying this, we had been fed, and many of us, I think, had bought into, well, there is no alternative. What Margaret Thatcher said, there is no alternative to capitalism, and it got abbreviated as TINA. And I think connected to that was a kind of resignation to the status quo. And the interesting thing about the 2016 election was the challenge to the status quo from both the left and the right. And I think that is, so suddenly something has been shaken loose. The neoliberal common sense has really been shaken loose. And what will fill it is a real question. So I agree, it was an exhilarating moment, the whole 2016 election, not the outcome, but it was exhilarating that the status quo was being so fundamentally challenged. And it was terrifying. And we've seen what has happened with Trump, and it is terrifying in many ways. And I think one of the tasks of the left, along with trying to kind of fill out the picture, create an imagined alternative future that we could build toward. I think another thing is really trying to help people inhabit the uncertainty of now and the felt contingency of now, where previously it was kind of people adapted to the neoliberal rhetoric of, you know, you're on your own and you better, you know, you need to, get a better job. Well, you go into debt and get yourself educated, and you need to do this and you need to do that. And I think that in this moment where there's a great, even more uncertainty for more people, many people have been living with tremendous precarity forever, but the uncertainty now is so tremendous for so many people. And, you know, I think and Trump says, well, I'll fix it. I'm the fixer. I can fix it, and people want an authoritative figure who can fix things. And the left, I think, sometimes historically has also presented a kind of knowing what is to be done. And I think increasingly there are leftists now who are much clearer about not knowing what is to be done, but figuring it out, and figuring it out collectively. But how to help people to inhabit that uncertainty, that unknowingness about what is to be done right now? I think that's a real question and really difficult.
I mean, the key there is for our messaging about what the future is to be something that really invites further kinds of imagination, rather than looking as though what we are doing is that we suddenly have a plan. You know, there's problems sometimes when you come forward and you want to offer a critique of some social problem or ill, and people say, well, what's your policy? There is very much in all of us this idea that in these moments when there are problems, what we need to do is to fix them, and to fix them means having some kind of solution that involves a certain kind of certainty. And I think this is where, you raise a really important point about the fact that what we need to do also is to be able to speak to the inevitability of some discomfort around social change and transformation. But it's also that very openness which creates the opportunities for people to articulate something for themselves and to begin thinking about governing themselves. That the part of them that is a little afraid about knowing what is going to come in the future is also the very same part of them that they can inhabit as an engaged democratic citizen who wants to get involved in the conversation and the imagining about what that future holds. So the idea like, well, we got to get back to certainty is really a little bit of this idea of like the desire for the technocratic state to be able to come back in and to shore things up. And that is actually, in that way, we should always see that we have that desire for certainty and for order, but it is always in a kind of tension with our desire for democracy and for being self-governed. Because being self-governed and democracy is uncertain business. It is uncomfortable business. And I think that we, in a gentle and open way, need to find ways to share the message with people that in order for things to get better, we need to be able to tolerate a degree of what feels scary to us. And right now, that's like, things are so scary that you're like, no, I don't want any of this scariness. I want to go all the way back. Mm-hmm. But we could begin to ask ourselves, what portion of this feeling of fluidity and uncertainty, how much of that can you tolerate going forward? How much of we don't know what it's going to be like when COVID is over and after the election, how much of that can you tolerate? I think that's a space where some real democratic possibility to sort of awaken and draw out the part of people to say, well, then get involved. Your involvement is part of what decides what goes in that space, not the imagination of the theorist.
Yeah, and I'd love to go a little deeper into this role of feelings and emotions in American politics in this moment. Because, as you all pointed out, we've had this left and right resistance to or opposition to our existing institutional structures. And I'll just flag that our next conversation next week will be specifically on some of the limitations of our existing political institutions and efforts to try and reform them. But, I think at the moment you have a certain sector of the American population that are looking to Biden to restore things to normal. Like things are so abnormal, like just a little stability from, Uncle Joe. And yet you all are talking about this sense of we need to be thinking about our political life as existing both within and outside of those formal political institutions. And how do we bring in a sense of hope and opportunity and vision going forward, not the technocrat, not the policy solutions or the, political economy structures that can counteract that sense of fear and some of the destructive politics that come out of that. So what are you seeing of, on the ground activities that are giving people hope, or how do we think about that role of hope in this moment and broadening people's understanding of what it means to engage in politics in America?
Yeah, I would say, I really appreciate the question, Chris. I think that, you know, now we are, I think, in a moment where there's tremendous nostalgia for the status quo, the neoliberal status quo, you know, prior to Trump. And during the Obama years, I think there was nostalgia, and the Clinton years and the Bush years, I think there was nostalgia for the welfare state, for the, you know, for some kind of a social safety net. And I think that, you know, this thing of trying to help people to inhabit uncertainty, one of the things that I see that I think those of us on the left are trying to do that I think is really important is mutual aid. And, you know, during the pandemic, during these catastrophes, climate catastrophes, there always is an eruption of mutual aid, of solidarity, of reciprocity, of care. And it's a politics of care that I think allows people to not feel so much like you're on your own, buddy, because actually there are all these people who are here to help, and returning to that sense of mutual aid, you know, where, and you know, I think it's important to make a distinction between charity and giving people things that they need, and mutual aid, where there's a recognition of we're interconnected and we're all in this together. And, you know, from each according to his needs, to each according to their, from each according to his ability, to each according to their needs. So I think I find that kind of mutual aid incredibly, I find it energizing and hopeful. And it really does erupt whenever, you know, when like the power outages in the fall, you know, I think I imagine and that people's texts and things were just lighting up saying, what do you need? Can I help you in various ways? And it was definitely happening here as well in Santa Cruz. So that's one thing that I think helps.
Well, it seems like, you know, we're all in some ways mutual aid, and Dean's points about democracy, right, is we're talking about democracy as like a lived practice of taking some kind of ownership over the decisions that affect your life, right? And we all want to have control over things that affect our lives, and we all want to, there's something very powerful about trying to help each other and create these spaces where it's not just receiving aid, but you know, you're ruling and ruled in turn. You're sort of sharing, you're going back and forth between being helped and helping others, right? And there's a kind of reciprocity to that sense that I am both vulnerable and can help, right? I'm neither a victim nor simply a helper or a victim, right? Which is what's different than charity, right? Where it's sort of this, you know, unidirectional, the helper and the helpee. And so it reflects this much more capacious sense of community and of self-governance. And I think that, though, is partly why elections have always been these sort of challenging spaces for the left, is because we have this much more capacious sense of what democracy ought to be. And the frustration with, you know, electoral politics, I think for a lot of us, and I mean, I've talked to students about this, is it always feels like rather than democracy as a lived practice that's part of your daily life, right? Democracy is part of who you are and what you do, right? Which I wish we talked more about. Citizenship as a practice, not a status, but, you know, and I feel like a lot of migrant justice movements have criticized citizenship, but they criticize the idea of it being a status. And what they try to do is they actually enact citizenship the way we would imagine it as a richer collective practice of mutual aid and solidarity, right? But I think that, you know, so our image of citizenship is so much bigger than what elections often are, which is sort of like go out and vote and then retreat again, right? You sort of have this moment where you go and you express a preference in a private space in a ballot box by yourself, express your private preference, and then retreat back where you can then be serviced by your representative. And I think we're all very clear that that turns out that doesn't work very well. That if you build a system on a form of representation that kind of operates really well with very few of us being involved, that it operates with a lot of money, that you know, if you don't give people democratic opportunities in a kind of lifelong way, elections are a very paltry act of democratic life. So on the one hand, I think that's been the left's kind of critique, and I think it's right in all these ways. On the other hand, we've also discovered that when it comes to elections, either we're either gonna make decisions or decisions are gonna be done to us. It's either by us or to us. And so I think this sort of, you know, the both andness of the need to transform the institutions we don't like, that if we don't like how our electoral systems are working, we have to change them. We have to get people to run for office. We have to, you know, if we don't like it, we have to fix it. And so that sense that, you know, it's not the whole story, but it's this really critical part of the story, but also we're trying to engage electoral politics, but not on the terms that electoral politics wants us to engage in. So I think that's a really interesting, contentious relationship to have with, like, I am yelling at all my students, like, you must vote, Jesus, vote. Like, you know, I joined the League of Women Voters. I'm like one of those ladies outside with a clipboard, like, please vote. You know, I'm totally down with, like, being part of the electoral process, but I have this massive critique of its limits. And so it's interesting to be concerned with institutions when you also see their limits. And I think that's kind of where we're at. We're no longer in a place where maybe I might have even been 20 years ago, where, you know, I just was very, you know, suspicious and I voted, but I had a different analysis of elections than what I have starting in 2000 and up to now.
Yeah. Well, and Dean, you talked a bit in some of our preparations for this conversation about the way that elections offer this sort of spectacle of bottom-up input.
Yeah.
But part of what I wonder if you can help us think a little bit about is, you know, Cristina, you talked about getting your students out in New York, and, you know, we're of course trying to get our students out in California. And the truth is, like, what we really need to be doing is figuring out how do we connect with voters in, you know, Florida and Ohio and, you know, Nevada and other places. And, you know, Dean, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about sort of how do we make this mutual aid and sense of mutual belonging connecting across this imagined community of a nation state?
Well, there you represent a challenge, because at some level, when you get to the level of national politics, right? And when you get to the level of national politics in which things are subdivided by the Electoral College, the experience that people might have of mutual aid in Oregon and around the fires, that might make them think differently about how to vote in their local election or whatever. Oregon is probably going to go for the Democrats anyway, right? So we have this kind of ways in which the system is cut up into little pieces. I think one thing that would be very important is that if we learn about these instances of mutual aid as this fantastic example, right, of people seeing their connectedness and seeing the ways that their participation in their connectedness can actually make change that they would like to see and that fits their values. Part of that is that we need to talk a lot more about those instances and the possibilities in mutual aid, and we need to be sharing the sort of information and stories about those things as broadly as possible, as much as we share the terrible, horrifying things that we see on our screens that give us this term doom scrolling, which is so much of the social media landscape that we inhabit today. So as a part of a kind of political program of, you could say, telescoping the political affect of possibility amid this widespread sense of abandonment, would be to sort of share the images of mutual aid and of local community action, as much as we spend sharing the images that represent our fears and our anxieties. And so while I am someone who normally would be like, social media has done way more harm than good, you've just given me the occasion to think about one possible arena in which how we can be thinking about a kind of national scale for sharing some of these insights that we're talking about today, which are, you know, a part of both the things that Cristina and Debbie have been saying, is that there's something really almost inevitably local about democracy and the democratic impulse and the democratic experience. And so I think the idea of how that is going to spread or how it's going to affect politics on a national stage is about really trying to help these imagination of these possibilities spread into other local spaces and to make them visible in these other local spaces as well.
So
Christina,
Christina,
I wanted to ask Dean this question about, you said something earlier that I just wanted to go back to it because I think it's so important when you were talking about like, democracy means we have to learn to sit with discomfort. Mm-hmm. And and I guess I wanted to think more about that. Like, what does it mean to cultivate a democratic temperament where you can sit with discomfort? And it feels like in some ways, the Black Lives Matter movement models that in some really powerful ways, in multiple ways, right? I mean, from communities that have been continually under conditions of massive violence and precarity, and are committed to democracy despite that. At the same time, I've been really struck by the fact that the number of white and non-Black participants in the movement, and I saw signs in New York, or people had signs that were like, confront your racist family members, white silence is complicity. And it felt like there was something happening, at least for some. I kept thinking of Baldwin and white innocence. And there was a group of, I was talking to friends who've like looked into their own families and been like, we were slave owners. And they're like sitting with that fact and having conversations in their families about that, about what is the role of enslavement in our own family's wealth. So I don't know, I just wanted to throw that back at the two of you, because I think there's something so powerful about a big part of what we need to do is sit with discomfort of all of our conflicted legacies and inheritances.
You directed that to Dean, but
I meant, well, I'm to both of you. He said discomfort, so.
But what you're saying is making me think about right after Trump's election, there was a lot of talk about his base or how he had been elected and so on, and and some of those responses were kind of, well, these white working class people who are racist, kind of irredeemably racist, and that analysis. And of course that got discredited in multiple ways. But one way that I think that's helpful for me to think about elections, actually, and what elections provide is an opportunity to talk to people and to learn about and to take very seriously the complexity of people's lives, and to try to attune to what they're feeling, like what is affecting them, what is bombarding them, what is impinging on them, that would produce an anti-immigrant politic or a white supremacist identification, or any of these things, which as social scientists, we know that people aren't born this way. People, for some reason, these things come into being, and we have to think about them historically, and what are the processes that help such sentiments and practices to crystallize and to take hold, and in the case of now, to become widespread or at least more public. And I think as a left politic needs to take that really seriously, looking at the complexity of people's lives, what they're going through, and what they're feeling, and then figure out ways of addressing that. And we need to be doing it with people who are more sympathetic. Those of us who see ourselves as on the left, we need to be doing it with other people who are more sympathetic, but also with people who aren't. And in a way, going door to door, we're not doing that as much anymore, but that kind of talking to people and listening to people to find out what are the complexities of people's lives, and how then to respond, how to pull people into a different kind of politic.
It's been a long time since I thought about phone banking, but the things that you guys have been talking about have been, and just all pieces of the last 10 minutes here have been making me think about something I did a really long time ago. And now that I think about it, there's a really kind of interesting scene. I went into a little, this was against Prop 8 in California many years ago. And I went into someone's home in my community that had invited a bunch of people in and figured out the whole phone thing. And so I was there with a group of people in my community. We were going to do this thing, and we were calling people all over California. And at first I was like, oh, it's going to be so weird. And it was uncomfortable because I was reaching into the living rooms of these people to talk about something with people that people often didn't really want to have a conversation about, which gay marriage, right? But had a lot of conversations. And I think that actually speaks a little bit to some of this, several of the, you know, I'm not saying everybody should get out and go do phone banking, but here is a kind of example that I think is emerging from some pieces of this conversation. Sort of quaint, but maybe quite powerful one. It also speaks to the importance of something that feels old-fashioned already, which is the possibility of persuasion, and about ourselves being persuadable people and being the kind of person who remains persuadable about some things, as well as a person who takes upon oneself the responsibility to learn how to be persuasive to others, which is not the same as simply beating them over the head with an idea or shaming them into believing something. But so I think that for these conversations, you know, to talk about discomfort and kind of democratic discomfort, these different kinds of images come to mind for me as the sorts of things like persuasion or conversations with strangers who are persuadable. Those are not comfortable and easy things to do, and yet they seem like they all contain within them some kernel of this piece that we're trying to pick up and bring forward.
I love this idea of like a left voter outreach project that was a really like a left project that was steeped in affect and really saw itself as like a chance for like an emotional engagement where because you know, often when you do that kind of work, the parties give you like a script and they say, tell this, do it this way. But you're both suggesting something that really is about voter engagement that's inviting people to not just engage in sort of just, you know, I don't know, like a simple moment of expression, but is an organizing moment, but also is trying to like, I don't know, like acknowledge all the different kinds of feelings we have in our politics, our fears, our hopes, our desires. Like it kind of puts all that on the table in a way that, because elections are so much focused on winning the election. And you're both describing something that's about growing democracy.
And I think that there's a way in which politics feels distant, like in the way you were talking about before, Cristina, where it's done to us by an elite and maybe technocrats. And you know, you go in or you mail in your ballot and you're done for until the next election. And so this is more of a, you know, a kind of listening and the discomfort of that. I like what you're both talking about on that level, and what we can learn from that, and persuasion and real conversations. We don't have much practice becoming political protagonists any longer. And so there's a way in which these kinds of conversations, small scale and larger scale, help us all to become political protagonists.
So we're going to move very soon to some questions from the audience, but Cristina, I wanted to come back to you with some issues that you've raised, but put it in the context of some of the issues you're raising in your new book. You know, thinking about the opportunities in this moment about the discussions around race and citizenship in our country. I mean, again, the title of your book, Cruelty as Citizenship, How Migrant Suffering Sustains White Democracy. And I think part of what I see in this moment that is part of the project of your book is to really interrogate the political practice of whiteness. And I think we're getting an awareness in this country at the moment that we need to understand that political practice of whiteness and how it's been exercised in ways that, you know, are xenophobic and demonize, you know, immigrants and others, particularly from Mexico and Latin America. But it seems to me there's also an opportunity in helping those of us who are white, and particularly across the country, understand how, in fact, we're dying of whiteness, in the words of Jonathan Metzl, but the ways that that politics of whiteness undermines our very democracy and nation in ways that, you know, we're seeing, as Debbie, you talked about, in the undermining of our public health system, just to name one. And Cristina, I wonder if you could just talk a little bit, you know, maybe touching on issues or themes in the book, but, you know, how you see the political opportunities emerging from really taking seriously that political practice of whiteness, and how do we understand that in this country?
Yeah, no, thanks. That's such a, to me, I remember the election had just happened in 2016, and I decided to teach Joel Olson's book, for those of you who know it, The Abolition of White Democracy. And it was a book a few years back. I'd read it when it came out, but teaching it with Trump recently elected was just sort of eye-opening, and it made me think about, oh, whiteness. We need to think about, you know, and here's this white scholar who's talking about the difference between white people and whiteness as a practice of domination, right? As a particular kind of politics of domination. And so one of the things that Joel died very tragically, very young, but one thing he had noted that I think he was really prescient about, and that I really wanted to build on, was part of what makes our world so polarized right now is that whiteness itself is dividing. And I think, look at Portland. When you look at the fighting going on in the streets of Portland, it is a group of white people fighting another group of white people. I mean, it's a multiracial coalition on the left, but there's a lot of white people fighting with a lot of white people in the streets. And I think that very fact that whiteness isn't doing the work it used to do. So I think we're in this, what struck me was we're in this interesting moment where whiteness is sort of bifurcating, and where you see some people, which doesn't mean that, progressives and liberals aren't still hampered by and struggling with their own sense of whiteness and privilege and their own dynamics of racism. I mean, that's an ongoing struggle for human beings, but there's definitely, I think, a divide there that is producing another sense of outrage for those who embrace nativism or white grievance politics or xenophobia, is that they see whiteness as this possibility, and other white people keeping it from them as well as, and are part of this multiracial coalition that is trying to offer up another kind of future. And I think that rage at that multiracial coalition that is turning its back, or at least trying to question or sit uncomfortably with the history of whiteness, is partly what is making our politics so divided. It's not just anti-Blackness, it's also the story of what it means when a fairly significant segment of white people also decide to critique anti-Blackness, right? Which is different than 50 years ago, when, the number of white anti-racists was, it was members of the Communist Party. It was very tiny segments of the left, which is sort of undergoing changes. So for me, one of the things I've just been really interested in is that since 1964, when you have the Voting Rights Act and you have a transition from what really was a white democracy in this country, where whiteness was instantiated in the law in particular ways. I think migrants remain migrants and policing are the two places where you can still engage in the racist politics of domination and do it under the guise of the rule of law. You can do violence to migrants and claim it's legal and important and authorized because they're not citizens. And therefore you can invoke the law to do violence on those people. Mm-hmm. And I think that desire, the thing I try to trace in the book is that isn't just a desire that's like racist, or it's not like Adam Sauer's point about, the cruelty is the point. He's right, but my point is that cruelty is actually also democratic. And that for a lot of white citizens for generations, Jim Crow was a democratic practice, right? If you were a waitress or a real estate agent or a teacher or a librarian, you got to enact Jim Crow on Black people. It was something you got to participate in. Mm-hmm. Participation in our democracy was deeply tied to participation in whiteness. And so I think we have to come up with new forms of participatory democracy that aren't based on domination. Mm-hmm. And that to me is and we don't really know what that looks like yet, right? Because we have never had a fully multiracial New Deal. So we can invoke I love talking about the New Deal because it was amazing, but it wasn't amazing for everybody in the same way. And so how do we paint that picture again of something that is a future we can all buy into, but also recognizing that a lot of things that feel like democracy and that feel like freedom for a lot of Americans is racial domination, or is enmeshed in racial domination.
So I'd love to have Debbie and Dean talk about this a little bit too, but I want to pull in a couple of questions that are, in different ways, very specifically about the politics of Trump and the 40+% of people that continue to support him. And so a two-part question that ties into some of these issues that Cristina is raising is, what is it about Trump's politics, how he enacts it and the things he's saying, that is leading to this 40+% of Americans to continue to support him? And how do we reach that part of America that we need to, you all said that in some different ways, to enact politics in a different way that isn't about choosing Democratic versus Republican, but re-envisioning a different set of politics in different America? Small questions.
I think that there is, I think what Cristina just said is so interesting, and I can't wait to read your book. I think there's pleasure in domination. There's pleasure in putting someone in their place. So, I think, people have talked about this Trump as kind of the id unleashed, and he embodies a kind of freedom that I think many people don't feel they have. The freedom to say whatever you want to say, the freedom to be racist, the freedom to be misogynistic, and so on. And so we have to kind of try to think about what creates the feeling of unfreedom that so many people feel. And I think it's, potentially connected to not having any control over your life, feeling like you have no control over so much. And that feeling of powerlessness and vulnerability can create a kind of an effort to blame others for it, and then to take great pleasure in someone just freely expressing that kind of domination or that kind of racism and misogyny. How to reach that, I'm not sure. Dean, you handle that part.
Yeah. I guess one thing that I hear expressed a little bit in the question is the idea that, so first of all, for purposes of the election, we're not going to reach that 40%, because even a landslide election, it would be a landslide if it was 60-40. It's really a different group of people who the Democrats are reaching toward right now, with their more centrist candidates and their centrist policies. And it doesn't appear that the right is reaching toward those people at all. It seems like they are trying to stoke these fears. And a lot of, I think the fears that Cristina was talking about, it just occurred to me like, oh yes, the shift from M13 to Antifa being the great danger out there really represents, I think, an awakening by the white supremacy right, that there are white non-allies out there in the political world. So that sort of was really coming home to me in Cristina's comments. I also think that there, in the idea of how to reach people like that after an election, also represents a little bit of a fantasy of unity that has never been the case in the United States, that that this kind of level of deep opposition is going to be there afterwards, and that a kind of political struggle around oppositional politics is going to be there for a really long time. But to go back to some of our more hopeful remarks around mutual aid and community participation and so on, there is a kind of living by, the best revenge is living well. There is a kind of possibility in the left here in these moments to think about democratic participation and living democracy differently, living democracy in the post-white democracy age. that I think what we have to do, and Debbie talked about pleasure, we have to make it attractive. We have to make it beautiful. It has to present its own pleasures to people so that they can see something in it. People for whom domination has been a source of pleasure for them in the political world, there needs to be some, the images of pleasure and beauty need to be there in the stories that we tell and the communities that we create through these kinds of democratic practices.
So one of the other questions that just came in, which is I think interesting and ties into this a little bit, is bringing these discussions about racial dynamics back again to the pandemic, but from a slightly different angle. So the question is, are we seeing new narratives or phrases changing our understanding of immigrants in relationship to the pandemic with our understanding of essential workers? In the food system, in our elder care facilities, that, all of a sudden these invisible workers are essential and heroes. And so maybe Cristina first and others as well. Do you see a change in the narrative and understanding of how we're understanding the role of immigrants in our society?
I think we could. I mean, I think the big question is, how do we make sure that people who are essential are not treated as disposable? How does essential not become disposable, right? That their lives can be sacrificed on the altar of a larger common good, so they can die in meatpacking plants, or as long as we get our meat, they're sort of disposable. But I think it's been so highlighted that the work that these communities do is so critical, and it's not in the same way of like the work that no one else will do, but it's sort of revealed an entire landscape of labor that should be valued, right? That I think that that we have an opportunity to really talk about, like, how do you compensate that, right? And what kind of better world would we have if people were both protected and compensated? And so, I mean, I think again, it's like another opportunity moment where there's been something revealed in this time, but and so that's my hope, right? But I also wanted to point back to something that that Debbie and Dean were saying about painting a world that people want to inhabit. Like, I'm not a parent, so I have no idea, but I've noticed this with my good parenting skills, my friends with good parenting skills, is instead of just getting into a fight with your kid about like what they're not doing, you give them something new to do, right? You stop fighting about that one thing and you're like, let's go do this, let's go run around here. And they're like, okay. And they're not like, they're still not bratty or crying about the thing they didn't get to do, but they actually can get turned towards something else. And it actually children tell you a lot about subjectivity, that we are many things inside. And so different parts of our grievance selves are the parts of us that are driven by a scarcity logic can be mobilized, but the parts of us that share maybe a different kind of common can also get mobilized. So like, how do you, instead of just fighting over why each side thinks they're wrong, how do we paint a picture of a world that they would want to inhabit? But that said, I really agree with Dean's point that we have to be really clear that we should be fighting over to convince every person, but they have to be defeated. This is about defeating women won the vote because some people won and some people lost. With slavery, some people won and some people lost. With segregation, some people won and some people lost. So they didn't all get won over. They got defeated. But in the defeat, you can win over more people. You can you can continually try to organize and grow the agreement. But I think we shouldn't be afraid of beating and defeating bad ideas and bad people and bad politicians. Like, we need to kind of embrace that fact and not get stuck into a unity narrative that Dean was suggesting.
It's another really interesting, do you want to answer
Well, just
that?
one thing to kind of echo something that Cristina was saying. I think that, the pandemic reveals a lot, and it manifests the kind of the ways that racial injustice, kind of is so structuring of people's life opportunities and outcomes and so on. And I think that, so it manifests that, but there's nothing about it there's nothing guaranteed. Just because it becomes really clear that we have that essential workers who haven't been compensated properly forever should be, there's nothing that makes it that will happen. We have to make it happen. And that's what Cristina was saying, I think. So I really agree with that. And so it's an opportunity for us to use what has been revealed and to try to open that up a little bit more and develop a politic around that.
So slightly different topic, but a really important question, which is linking the question about elections with governance. And the question is, isn't there a fundamental restoration of governance and getting stuff that's done that is critical? And I want to put that in a context too of, thinking about, on the one hand, those of us on the left critiquing the neoliberal evisceration of the state. I mean, Grover Norquist's quote of, he doesn't want to abolish government, he just wants to make it small enough where he can drown it in a bathtub. And then you've got Trump on the other side pulling out the deep state, right? The people that are the civil servants and those governing and implementing the policies that he wants to root out because of the ways that it's undermining his objectives. So, how do we think about the role of government and governance at this moment in the context of this election and what's at stake?
I mean, one thing that the last 4 years has made me a lot more attentive to is my attachments to the rule of law and to stable institutions, such that they can become sort of solid targets for me in thinking about abolition, reform, change, and so on. And as solid structures within which I can see the operation, more or less, of the different structural forces that drive inequality in our society. So the rapid undermining of these institutions, not just from the neoliberal, you put your finger on it these two ways. First, the neoliberal undermining of the institutions, and now this kind of like straight up eviscerating or gutting of the institution from within is troubling in its own way, because I don't think it is the kind of dismantling and reworking of political institutions that we have in mind on the left. It does offer certain kinds of opportunities for imagination about what we want to build back up in terms of these kinds of institutions, or what kinds of institutions do we want, because rebuilding work is going to have to be done if the opponent is defeated, as Cristina has put it. A certain kind of rebuilding work is going to have to be done, and that really, I think, is where a lot of opportunities lie. But I think that I myself have came to expect that the smooth functioning of these institutions and their solid nature was going to be something that would always be there for me to think and struggle against in a particular sort of way. And so I've discovered my attachment to that. And it was a sort of a cruel attachment in a way. But so there is an opportunity there, but something has to be defeated first so that the reimagining opportunity can come forward. That's something being Donald Trump.
Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's funny. It's like I've sort of thought to myself that sometimes it's like, traditional governance was like, like the mom that you were annoyed at, and then like your abusive uncle showed up, and like all of a sudden like the lights don't work and we don't have heat, and and you're like, oh, my mom was a pain, but she wasn't this bad. It's like there's something about assuming that there's sort of a level of competency. Like I would wear a T-shirt now that says like I heart the deep state, because like I'm just like I'm sort of frustrated by, but also like so inspired by just competent civil servants in a way that I didn't think about before this, right? In the same way. But I just want to follow up on Dean's point about, I think there's something interesting about American institutionalists. We've had a kind of almost like we treat the Constitution and we treat our form of governance like this sort of fetishized antique, that for a long time like couldn't be touched or changed, and we can't get rid of the filibuster because it has a long history, and we can't get rid of the electoral college, like all the founding fathers did them, and so we can't change them because the founding fathers, and I think, and we didn't trust ourselves, right? We trusted their brilliance and we didn't trust ourselves. And I think that one of the other interesting, maybe interesting productive casualties that the Black Lives Matter has done is that the founders are being looked at as what they were, which was complex people with, certain moments of brilliance and fatal flaws. And they were human beings who built institutions. And those were also premised on dispossession and settlement and slavery. And it's a complicated, hard, ugly, and inspiring history all at once. And we have to teach it and think it and learn it that way. And I think it's helped us think about, okay, if that's the case, then what should these institutions look like? And what's up with the Senate? And what's up with, you know, and so I think, I don't know, I feel like for the first time I was talking to Dean about one of his colleagues and one of the future conversations you're having. And I think that people who are, you know, institutionalists are raising questions about the institutions in new ways. The conversation's shifting. And I think that's all for the good, because we can't just protect it like it's some antique that we have to hold true to. We have to make it work for us. And I think that might be open in a way now that it hasn't been before now.
Yeah, and I'll say there are a number of questions here about those institutions, specifically about the Senate or the Electoral College. And just again, to advertise next week, Tuesday night, that will be the focus of our conversation, is those institutions. But there is a question related to that I would love to have your perspective on, which has to do, as part of our electoral process, two things. One, the role of money. How do we think about the role of money, not just in elections, but in our sort of political life? And related to that, I think, is the role of facts and truth. And this is another question, is like, what do you do when people who have money and access to media and get it out there don't seem to care whether truth is part of the message that they're communicating? And I would say that on both the left and the right, because some of the studies have shown that many of the Democratic Party candidates, you know, many of their statements, not as bad as some of Trump's, can be seen as by PolitiFacts, not as entirely true. So I think it is something about our media system, not individual candidates. I wonder if any of you can comment on that. Money in politics and truth in politics.
I mean, maybe I would just start by saying that these questions really highlight, I think, in a stark way, the problem of scale in democracy. And that we have been, in our own ways, really wanting to talk about the democratic experience is at its heart a local, close-in experience of people who know things about the conditions of their lives, being able to begin to assert a shared say in those conditions, which they live in the communities of people they know and people they don't. And there's a real part of the real problem that we face with scale is that when it gets to a certain scale, questions like money, the role of representation and what representation does and how it functions, these things become major kinds of problems for us that are in that way quite intractable. Your question was about money, and what was the other piece? And truth. So, you know, and then the other thing is that in our own communities, in our own life worlds, we have gut senses and lots of ways to check the information we're receiving and how much it corresponds to the world as it is around us. And a lot of different people we can talk to and a lot of perspectives that we can bring in, and a lot of ways we can gauge those things. When you get up to this massive level, this is where people begin, instead of wanting to know stuff about the conditions of their community, they become affiliated with a complex meta-narrative that then they seek to defend at any cost, right? Their perspective on which party is correct about climate change, for example. So I hate to say it, I'm extremely pessimistic when it comes to these kinds of questions. And I don't think there's an easy answer to them, because I think scale is itself a part of the problem that we face. Now, I do tell my students, if you really want to do stuff, some things you can do include organizing to overturn Citizens United, and organize to overturn the Electoral College. I think those are two big institutions that the overturning of which and the abolition of which could make a really big difference for these two questions that you're posing. But money and facts, the media landscape, all that stuff comes together. And to me, I think about them all as questions of scale. And it's a problem.
Well, it's interesting thinking about scale, because the next question that I was going to pull up actually brings in the global dimension and a recognition that the world follows US elections, and particularly this elections. And so the elections aren't just about us, but about global politics and a global community. And the question is, what thoughts do you have about how the imagination, the desires, the hopes you're all calling for in different ways include an understanding of global interconnectivity, including both human and non-human. We're dealing with little questions in this conversation today.
Yeah.
Really broadening people's understanding, our understanding of politics. But it's a really important question, our global interconnections. How do we think about that in our US politics?
I mean, here's where migration is a great example, because there's such an intense politics around it. And yet there is also a very local dimension to it, which is migrants who come to the United States are settled in local communities and become part of local communities. And so while the narrative of the migrant right now, and the one that has been heavily politicized, and COVID became a special opportunity for the administration to shut down refugee resettlement programs, the questions of migration are the places where these global issues of concern of climate catastrophe and the way that it's disrupting food supplies and driving wars and so on all throughout the world, disaster capitalism, brings people to begin to flow and move around the globe. And then how are they received? So there's a kind of local dimension that can be, people can advocate for having refugee resettlement in their communities. And so those kind of connections can be made. And that's sort of a really big way of trying to pull that into a particular topic. And maybe my panel friends can save me a little bit from stumbling down any rocky paths on that one.
No, I felt like I was like, I talk too much, but no, I think that's exactly right. And I think that one of the disappointing things that's happened is seeing the global. We were in, my husband and I were in London when Brexit happened. And, and that kind of realization that like, oh, we're not the, we thought we were the crappy place. It's like, oh, there's this brokenness is global. And it was, and it was right before the election. So it was just, it just never stopped. Right. But that worry that watching the global order get unsettled and watching nativism and xenophobia and these scarcity logics around climate change and climate refugees and just, and again, I think this speaks to what we've been talking about is we really need to find a language that can resist the scarcity logic, the containment logic that is, my country is this boat and there's no room, as Trump keeps saying, there's no room. When in fact, I know Matt Iglesias just wrote a book that's called, I think, like 1 billion. Like actually, there's a lot of room. There's a lot of possibility, and there's a lot of possibility for abundance, and and so I think that the kind of language we need to put forward could have resonances globally, and that could be really, really powerful. I think one thing that struck me that I'm not sure is a good or bad issue is America sort of has taken a back seat on the world stage because of Trump and his failures. But it's also done this interesting thing to American exceptionalism. I haven't thought about this. I've thought about it, but I haven't thought about it. But I feel like there's something interesting about this moment where the U.S. is standing, has maybe oriented other nation states to think about themselves differently in relationship to what was once this sort of stable place that is not any longer. And that could go badly. That could lead to other kinds of, it could lead to the rise of regimes that we don't support or regimes that are even worse. But it also pushes back on this idea that we're the center of everything that I think could be useful in a way too, that like there's something in the same way that we haven't had a president. Bonnie Honig wrote this great essay that said the White House is empty. Like we've essentially had somebody who's given up on governing effectively, has given up on decent governance. And that sense that we've had to say, oh, we're gonna have to do this. Like mutual aid is survival. Like we're gonna have to, if we want a decent democracy, we have to make it. It's something interesting has happened on the global level as well, where I think they're sort of like, oh, we can't just assume America is gonna be this particular place. We're gonna have to do this. Like there's something interesting about all of us. It's been a reorienting and disorienting moment that I think globally we don't know the outcome of that yet. And some of it is going to be good and some of it's going to be bad. But I think realizing, I think what's distressing to me is just realizing that the issues like climate require global levels of initiative and not being sure that there's the will here or there, but we're going to have to make the will because we're going to have to save our own lives. And that's what we have to do. So.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add is that these scale issues, when we scale up and we think about the rise globally in authoritarianism, climate catastrophe, if we think about it globally, economic collapse globally, we think about all of that, it's incredibly overwhelming, and overwhelmedness is a real political affect. And so, you know, I think, I don't have an answer, but I think we have to figure out how to, you know, you kind of have to start where you are, and people, and when we get overwhelmed, we can get very paralyzed and feel like, oh my God, there's just too much, and forget it. Let me just go into my, you know, I'm already stuck in my house, so let me just stay stuck in my house, if I'm lucky enough to have one. And so I just think we always have to keep in mind the overwhelming nature of the social problems that we face, and do the work to help all of us address that overwhelmedness by actually, you know, starting where you're at, because that's the only way you can start. Yeah.
So Debbie, you're actually highlighting what I wanted to end with. We've got about 7 minutes left, and I just wanted to pull out, I'm not sure this is much a question, but a couple of comments here of people talking about people that they know, friends, who are busy doing voter conversations with people in other states, in Florida, in the South. You know, don't you think that the rise and proliferation of ways that concerned voters can affect the outcome in Florida and other battleground states is one of the most significant developments in elections? I know of so many people who are making calls, writing letters, doing all they can beyond their immediate geography to make a huge impact right now. And someone else references a group showing up for racial justice that's doing a lot of phone banking right now with undecided white voters. And so I want to put that as a context to ask each of you in your own individual lives and thinking what a number of people have said and commented about, which is this living with discomfort, understanding that the kind of change we're living in the moment requires us to not have security and comfort in what we're used to. And how do you each live with that in a way that provides hope and possibility in your own political life and how you're expressing your own set of politics and values? And maybe Dean, I'll start with you and then go around the circle and we'll end up that way.
Well, I'm glad that phone banking came up again, because it does seem to me to be a real kind of example of a concrete participatory way to be involved that actually, insofar as it involves your voice, you're actually talking to someone. Creates the feel, you know, as I'm talking right now, I have the feeling of my voice in my body and the feeling of my voice making a difference and so on. So I really like that example. And I think that really something that gives me a lot of hope is getting into conversation with people who I don't fully agree with, but who I can have an exchange with in which both of us are changed in some way. And I think that as long as we continue having those kinds of conversations, and sometimes it's just with a family member, it could be with a neighbor who you're getting to know better because now you're always at home. I think practicing having those kinds of conversations around all kinds of different topics, and not even avoiding the uncomfortable topics, but just feeling your way into those kinds of topics. I think that is something that I have found. I bring up the thing about my neighborhood because suddenly I know my neighbors so much better than I used to. I'm not just always hopping in my car and going away. And I found myself having a lot more conversations with people who I am getting to know and who I don't agree with entirely. And so I found a lot of comfort in that process.
Christina, what about you? Living with discomfort and hope.
Yeah, it's really, get a really good therapist. That's my, we should all do that. Everyone should do that. Everybody listen, everybody, the sound of my voice, find somebody good. I think, yeah, I think Dean's point about, I think the being isolated, being socially distant has also reminded me of how much relationships really matter. My friendships matter, the people I care about, the connections you want to have with people. And I think that, this sounds sort of cheesy, but I think that even after the election, after 2016, I came to this very large class I teach, sort of an intro to Latino studies. And I was just devastated from the election. I just started talking to the students, and I found enormous comfort in listening to them, because they were all really thoughtful about, you know, what did I do in this election? What did I not do? You know, what kind of future are we going to build? And it always just reminds me that you shouldn't have to go to college to have that experience that Dean's talking about, the experience of being with groups of people who are strangers to you, but who through dialogue and discussion and a shared conversation over time, you are shaped by each other, right? You come into the room thinking one thing and you leave thinking another, right? That should be a part of our civic life. That shouldn't be something that only happens if you can afford to go to college. That should be part of our civic culture. And I think that one thing that I think we have to start thinking about is I think one thing that has struck me tonight is the fact that there's so many things that we do during elections that kind of remind us that those are things that we should be doing all the time, like talking to our fellow citizens about what they care about. I mean, right now there's a lot of panic because Latinos in Florida are not going for Biden in big enough numbers. And there's a lot of anxiety about that, partly because there's a lot of Cuban Republicans, and so they're not going to go for Biden no matter what. But there's also, Latinos in electorally are a very young population. And a big part of this is, the way I've described it, is you have to turn non-voters into voters. And that takes a lot of work and energy. But it's really about turning non-participants into activists, into civically engaged people, into citizens in the best, highest sense of that word. And so I think, you know, we need to really reinvigorate that idea. I think what I'm doing right now is I get so scared and anxious reading the paper every day. I check my phone in the morning, and then I'm like, that was the worst idea ever. But I compulsively do it. I'm just trying to do everything I can. I'm writing postcards, I'm writing letters. My father-in-law has written 300 letters to people in other states and Wisconsin. I think this is the kind of election where we should all do everything we can. I've always said, I'm not a massive fan of Biden. He's grown on me more. I think he's a decent, good human being, good man. He's a good person in a lot of ways, but he was not my first choice. But I think of him as, this nation is sort of bleeding out. He's the tourniquet that staunches the bleeding. Like, we need to staunch, you know, we're bleeding out. We are in crisis. We need to stop the crisis. This election is about stopping the crisis so we can begin to do a lot of the other work that we're going to have to do no matter what, but we have to do. So I think when I do something, when I text, or whenever I do anything involving the election, I feel better. I don't feel as scared or as alone when I do something. So I think if you're feeling those feelings, try to do something, you know, around this election, and Jesus, far beyond. But I think that sense of doing something right now is what's keeping me from losing my mind in the next
Great. And Debbie, we'll give you the last word. We got about a minute left.
Okay, yeah, just quickly, I think what helps me to inhabit uncertainty, I think is the different activist scenes that inspire me and that I try to participate in, and that's where the world building and imagining that is, you know, the most compelling to me is going on. And it's where people are improvising and experimenting and learning from mistakes and teaching me a tremendous amount. And doing it locally and scaling up as much as possible. But, you know, for those of us at Santa Cruz, supporting the graduate students in their efforts to get a COLA was a really incredible experience for, I think, a lot of people who were involved in that, being involved with the graduate students there, you know, and fighting for public education. And then in Santa Cruz more broadly, You know, there are left organizations like DSA that are really trying to, for example, deal with the problem of the unhoused population. So there's a group called the Love Boat that does mutual aid in town. And the Eco-Socialist Working Group that's trying to make the connection between abolition and ecology and the climate change and white supremacy. And sorry. So the activist scenes are really a site that helped me to deal with what's overwhelming to me and to deal with the uncertainty of the moment, and to kind of be in it with others, you know.
Great. Well, I want to thank you. Christina, do you want to do one more word?
I really want to say really quickly, just because this is I just wanted to note, like, I came to Santa Cruz as an 18-year-old and I became a political, just everything Debbie was saying was making me, I became a political actor in Santa Cruz. You know, I became a mechista, I joined Mecha, I joined the Third World Coalition, and I became a young activist in Santa Cruz. That's where I became a political theorist at Santa Cruz. Like, it was this place where intellectual and activism were so melded. And so I just want to just give a shout out that.
So here's the answer to everyone listening is if you want to live with uncertainty, come to Santa Cruz again, come back.
Very rich place to learn the political, is just to echo Debbie's point.
Anyway, thank you, Debbie. Thank you, Dean. Thank you, Christina. Thank you to all of you for joining us tonight for a great conversation. I had a lot of fun. I hope you all did too. I learned a lot. I put in the chat the link to information on the other series. Again, next week, Dan Worrells from the Politics Department will be here with Kathy Fong from Common Cause, talking about reforming the Electoral College, gerrymandering, the Senate, the Supreme Court. How do we think about reforming the institutions of our democracy? So with that, well, thank you all, and hope to see you all next week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, Dean and Christina and everyone.
Thank you so much. This was so great.